An Oklahoma social media influencer murdered by her husband.
Don't know what's going on behind people's doors. You know, you think everything's fine, and something like this happens. You just, it just makes you sad.
Yeah, leading up to what appears to be a murder-suicide, records show that Gilson had filed several protective orders against Duffy. 6 weeks after this protective order was filed, Gilson was killed. Owasso police say there is no threat to the public right now and that they're calling this an isolated tragedy.
Most people keep their family's darkest secrets hidden. Sara Gilson did the opposite. When she discovered what investigators say her husband had been hiding, she didn't stay silent. She filed for protection. She warned thousands of people online. She believed the truth would protect others. 13 days later, police say her husband came back and shot her. But this story didn't begin with a murder. It began inside a school gym, where one coach refused to ignore what everyone else had missed. Months before any of this happened, a television camera caught two ordinary parents outside an Oklahoma elementary school. A local news crew was covering a different story entirely. Allegations that money meant for children had gone missing from a school fundraising account, and stopped a woman and a man for a quick reaction. The woman spoke about how upsetting it was that money meant to help kids had allegedly been stolen. The man beside her spoke about protecting children. 90 seconds of airtime, two voices in a story about somebody else's wrongdoing. Nobody watching had any reason to remember their faces. Her name was Sara Gilson. His name was Jeremiah Sean Duffy. And at that moment, neither of them was the story. They would become the story soon enough. Sara had built a life well beyond that parking lot interview. Online, under the name most people knew her by, she had an audience of more than 30,000 people. A following built the way most real ones are, slowly, through consistency, humor, and the kind of content that feels less like a performance and more like catching up with a friend. People followed her because she felt real. Sean coached basketball, a traveling, competitive youth team, the kind of role that comes bundled with an unspoken contract of trust. Parents hand their kids over to coaches, assuming that person has earned the right to that responsibility. By every outward appearance, they were simply two parents living an ordinary Oklahoma life. What almost no one around them knew was that something had already been happening for a long time, something that would eventually pull their names into a headline neither of them could have imagined standing in that parking lot months earlier. What exactly had been happening, and for how long, is something even investigators would only fully understand one piece at a time. June 9th, just after 8 o'clock in the evening. At an elementary school on North Ash Street in Owasso, a traveling basketball team had rented the gymnasium while the public school itself sat quiet for summer break. It was an ordinary practice, the kind that plays out in gyms like this one every night of the week. Parents pulling into the lot, saying quick goodbyes, promising to be back in an hour. Basketballs echoing off the hardwood. Coaches calling out drills. Whistles cutting through the noise every few minutes, sending kids sprinting through suicides, through layup lines, through the same repetitive motions that make up any ordinary youth practice anywhere in the country. For most of that hour, nothing about the gym would have stood out to anyone walking past it. Just the ordinary soundtrack of a summer practice. Sneakers squeaking against hardwood, a ball clanging off the rim, a coach's voice cutting through with instructions, the occasional laugh from a kid who'd just been called out for missing a layup. Parents sat in folding chairs along the sideline, scrolling their phones, half watching, the way parents do at the 100th practice of a long competitive season. Then, everything changed. According to police, another coach on the team witnessed something involving Sean Duffy and a young girl on the roster. What he saw was enough to make him intervene immediately, not hesitate, not wait to be sure, not give it the benefit of the doubt, not tell himself he'd misread the situation the way people sometimes do when what they're seeing feels too disturbing to be real. He stopped it on the spot, in front of other players, other parents, in the middle of an evening that, 30 seconds earlier, had looked like every other practice that season, and he went straight to the child's parent. By the time that parent arrived to collect their daughter, they already knew enough not to go home. They went to the police department instead. What exactly did that coach see? What made him certain enough to act without a moment's hesitation in a gym full of witnesses on an ordinary Tuesday night? Those specifics remain part of the official record. But whatever it was enough to end a practice, end an evening, and set off an investigation that would eventually stretch across state lines. That single moment, one coach, refusing to look away when it would have been far easier to convince himself he was wrong, is the reason any of what follows ever came to light at all. Without him, there's no way of knowing how much longer this would have continued unnoticed. Roughly an hour after whatever happened inside that gym, a juvenile and her parent walked into the Owasso Police Department to report it. Detectives began piecing together what they were dealing with, and almost immediately, the scope of it grew far larger than a single incident on a single night. According to the police report, similar conduct toward this same child had reportedly been occurring over an extended period, across multiple states, in multiple law enforcement jurisdictions, long before Owasso ever entered the picture. This wasn't an isolated lapse. It was, according to investigators, a pattern that had apparently followed this child for some time, unnoticed or unreported, until one coach in one gym in Oklahoma decided not to look away. By the time officers understood what they were looking at, the man at the center of it was already gone. Duffy had fled the scene that night, and police would not see him again. Detectives believed they were only hours away from making an arrest. They had a witness, they had a victim, they had a parent's report filed within the hour. Every piece seemed to be falling into place for what should have been a straightforward case. Then they discovered something that stopped the entire investigation in its tracks. During the course of their work, detectives learned that Jeremiah Sean Duffy was a citizen of the Osage Nation, and because the alleged incident had occurred on tribal land, that single fact carried enormous legal weight. Here's why it mattered, in plain terms. Under the Federal Major Crimes Act, certain serious offenses, including sexual crimes against children, committed by a member of a federally recognized tribe on tribal land, don't stay with local police at all. They become the jurisdiction of the federal government, investigated and prosecuted through a completely different system, with a completely different timeline. It's a law most people outside of law enforcement have never heard of, tucked into a legal framework that dates back more than a century, and one most people would never expect to determine the outcome of a case like this one. But it does, every time the facts line up the way they did here. The charge, lewd molestation of a minor, was reclassified accordingly and sent up to the U.S. Attorney's Office for review. For the Owasso Police Department, that meant the case, and the man at its center, was no longer theirs to pursue. Procedurally, their investigation ended there. Not because the evidence was insufficient, and not because anyone doubted what had happened, but because of where, geographically and legally, it had happened. A few hundred yards in either direction, and this entire case might have unfolded completely differently. For Sara, it meant something else entirely. The man accused of hurting a child was still somewhere out there, unarrested, uncharged in any court that could act quickly, while a federal review, by its very nature, would take time she didn't yet know she wouldn't have. Federal cases involving this kind of jurisdictional handoff can take weeks or months just to be assigned, let alone prosecuted. In the meantime, the man accused was simply gone, no longer a fugitive from local police, not yet formally wanted by anyone with the authority to bring him in. A gap in the system, measured in paperwork and jurisdiction, that Sara now had to live inside of. What was Sara supposed to do with that information? As it turned out, there was exactly one thing available to her. What investigators could offer her immediately wasn't an arrest, it was paperwork. On June 10th, Sara sought and was granted an emergency protective order against her husband through the Tulsa County Courthouse. The order was specific. Duffy was to stay at least 100 yards away from her and her home at all times. For weeks after that, from the outside, there was quiet. No further reports of any violation reaching Owasso police. No public incident. just a protective order sitting in a file, a federal case moving somewhere through a process most people never see the inside of, and a woman trying to figure out how to rebuild a life around a discovery no spouse is ever prepared to make. But quiet, it would turn out, was not the same thing as safe, and Sara, for her part, wasn't content to simply wait quietly and hope the system moved fast enough. In the weeks that followed the protective order, Sara made a decision that would ripple far beyond her own social media following. She decided not to stay silent. She began speaking publicly, not just to close friends, not just in private conversations, but to the more than 30,000 people who followed her online. Whatever it was she now knew about her husband, she wasn't going to sit on it. What she posted and how she chose to say it would go on to define the final chapter of her public life. It would spread faster than she could have anticipated, reach people she'd never meet, and, though she couldn't have known it yet, become one of the very last things the world would ever see her post. We'll come back to that moment. But first, it's worth pausing on who Sara actually was. Not the headline, not the case file, but the woman behind the decision to speak up at all. To the people who knew her, Sara Gilson wasn't defined by tragedy. She was defined by warmth and by a sense of humor that made her online presence feel less like content and more like companionship, the kind of person people felt they knew even if they'd never met her in person. Her videos leaned into self-deprecation, the kind of humor that invites people in rather than performing for them, built one honest post at a time over years. Long before any of this began, she was a mother. Her son, the same teenager who would later place a call no child should ever have to make, was part of the life she'd built and was actively trying to protect, even as everything around her was falling apart. That's who was about to speak. On July 11th, Sara opened TikTok. She joined a trend that had already been used by millions of people, the Netflix documentary format, where creators sit for a mock tell-all interview about the twists and turns of their own lives, playing it equally for humor and confession. It's the kind of video that usually ends in a punchline, a breakup, a messy roommate situation, something exaggerated for laughs. Sara's version wasn't a joke. Her caption read, "Preparing for when Netflix drops a documentary about my soon-to-be ex-husband, who I just found out is a pedophile." She followed it with a second line. "I wish I was joking." There it was. The secret she'd been carrying since that June evening, now stated plainly, publicly, to an audience of 30,000 people who had followed her for years for entirely different reasons. The video spread the way this kind of post always does. Part shock, part solidarity, comment sections filling with strangers offering support. Within hours, it had moved well beyond her usual audience, shared and reshared by accounts that had never heard of her before that day. The algorithm doing what it does with anything that carries this much raw emotional weight. And then something else started happening. Other women began commenting, some of them claiming they'd had their own unsettling encounters with Sean over the years, pieces of a pattern nobody had ever put together publicly until that moment, now surfacing in a comment section for anyone to see. Strangers finding each other through a single video and realizing, in real time, that their individual, isolated discomfort with this man was part of something much larger. It's worth remembering something here. The woman posting that TikTok wasn't trying to go viral. She wasn't building drama for an audience. She was trying to protect people. The same instinct that had sent her to the courthouse for a protective order weeks earlier, now aimed outward at anyone else who might one day cross paths with her husband. Nobody watching that video, including Sara herself, could have known it would become one of the last things she ever posted. 13 days later, everything changed. Thursday, July 23rd, just after 11 at night, Owasso police received a domestic violence call from a residence in Collinsville, inside their jurisdiction. Dispatchers picked up the line. They heard a woman screaming. Then, according to 911 audio later obtained by reporters, a loud bang. Dispatchers tried again and again to reach whoever had called. Silence. No response, no matter how many times they tried to hail the line back. Moments later, A second call came through, this one from a juvenile, calling from a neighbor's house, his voice carrying the kind of urgency that stays with the people who hear it. He told the dispatcher his stepfather had shot his mother. Officers arrived within minutes. They stepped inside. The screaming had already stopped. They found Sara first. Then, in another part of the home, a second body. Jeremiah Sean Duffy. Sara Jane Gilson Duffy, 43 years old. Both she and Duffy were found dead from apparent gunshot wounds to the head. Investigators would ultimately describe it as an apparent murder-suicide. Her teenage son had witnessed the shooting before fleeing to the neighbor's house to call for help. The same call that had reached dispatchers only minutes earlier. He was taken into protective custody at the scene and later released to a parent not involved in the incident. Investigators confirmed one more detail in the aftermath, one that would only deepen the questions surrounding that night. No reports had been made to Owasso police of Duffy violating the protective order at any point between June and that Thursday in July. As far as official records showed, the order had gone unreported as broken, right up until the night it apparently was. What had changed that Thursday? Why that night, after 13 days of apparent silence? That question would only partly be answered by what surfaced next. In the days that followed, more of the picture began to surface. Pieces that painted a fuller, far more troubling portrait of the man behind the coaching whistle and the local news soundbite. Stephanie Ramsey, Duffy's ex-wife from a relationship that had spanned 2 decades before this one, came forward publicly. She told reporters she was shocked by what he'd allegedly done, but she said she wasn't surprised. 2 decades is a long time to know someone, long enough to recognize patterns that a newer partner might still be learning. According to Ramsey, Duffy had made threats throughout their 20 years together. Patterns of behavior she said she recognized instantly the moment she heard the news, patterns that, in her account, hadn't changed much between the marriage she'd lived through and the one Sara was now living through. She said Sara had known too that he was capable of violence, that this wasn't some hidden side of him that only appeared at the very end, but something that had apparently been present, in different forms, for a very long time. Why had she stayed in contact with Sara at all, given her own history with the same man? It's a fair question, and Ramsey's answer suggests something almost protective in the arrangement. She said she and Sara had stayed in touch over the years, particularly during stretches when Sara and Sean were apart, the kind of quiet solidarity that can form between a man's past and present partners once they realize they're looking at the same patterns from different angles at different points in time. 2 women, connected by a shared understanding neither of them had asked for, checking in on each other in a way that outsiders might not fully understand, but that made perfect sense to them. The 2 women had spoken just days before the shooting. According to Ramsey, the conversation centered on the wave of women commenting on Sara's viral TikTok, some of them claiming they'd had their own unsettling experiences with Sean over the years, each comment adding one more data point to a picture that was only just beginning to take shape publicly. What had been, for years, a private understanding between a small number of women was suddenly becoming something much more public, much more undeniable, and, Ramsey suggested, something Sean himself may have been watching unfold in real time. Ramsey said she believed there was more building beneath the surface than the social media attention alone suggested. She described Sean as someone with a deep-seated jealous streak, someone who, in her words, couldn't tolerate the idea of a partner moving on. A trait, she suggested, that had apparently followed him from one relationship into the next, unaddressed and unresolved across 20-plus years and at least 2 marriages. It raises a question that may never have a clean answer. If the pattern had been visible for that long, to that many people, why did it take this long and cost this much before it became impossible to ignore? None of what Ramsey described appears to have reached police in any actionable way before July 23rd. A protective order existed on paper, a federal case sat somewhere in review. But between all of that documentation and the porch light going dark that Thursday night, there was, as far as the record shows, no report, no call, no single moment substantial enough to trigger intervention before it was too late. Detectives are still working to reconstruct the full timeline of that final night. What specifically triggered it? Whether any warning signs in those 13 days were visible to anyone close enough to intervene? And what, if anything, could have been done differently once that protective order was granted? What investigators have confirmed is the sequence of events and the cause of death. What remains unknown, and may stay that way, is the exact moment things turned, the specific spark, if there was one, that ended 13 days of apparent quiet. The investigation remains open, even with both people at its center now gone. Before we go further, if you appreciate documentaries that dig past the headlines to find the full truth, consider subscribing. It helps more than you'd think. Months earlier, a television camera captured an ordinary couple outside a school. They weren't the story. They were simply two parents giving their opinion for a segment about something else entirely. Looking back now, those few seconds of footage feel completely different. A woman talking about protecting children. Standing beside the man, investigators say had already begun a pattern that would eventually destroy multiple lives. Sara believed exposing the truth would protect other families. Instead, it cost her own life. Long after the headlines disappear, her son will still remember making that phone call. He'll still remember running to the neighbor's house. And he'll still remember the last night he ever saw his mother alive. Sometimes the most dangerous secret isn't the one that's hidden, it's the one someone finally decides to expose.